Hi there! If you've gone through our previous courses, you've spent a lot of time digging into the intricacies and significance of setting up a project for success. And now, we're at the project execution stage, where all of that hard work comes together. If you haven't gone through our previous courses yet, we recommend checking them out. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name's Elita, and I'll be your instructor for this course. I work as a Senior Engineering Program Manager at Google, where I currently lead the team behind routing and navigation on Google Maps. I joined the company in 2007, working on teams across Google's engineering organization in New York, London, and Seattle. And in 2013, I joined the Google Maps team and launched popular features like holiday hours and attributes on businesses, while leading global teams from New York to Sydney to Hyderabad. Generally, I like solving problems and learning new things. Every new project and team allows me to do both. I'm excited to lead you through this course and demonstrate how to put a project plan into action. First up, you'll learn more about risks and unforeseen changes to the project. If you've taken our previous courses, you might recall that change is inevitable. And to combat that, we've covered the concept of risk mitigation during the planning phase. And now we'll take it one step further and discuss what to do when a risk actually materializes. Next, I'll discuss tracking and quality. You'll learn how to track and measure your project's progress, and you'll learn how to use continuous improvement and quality management techniques to keep the project on track and running smoothly. These best practices are valuable to just about any role, and I'm looking forward to taking you through them. Other big aspects of running a project include decision-making. You'll learn to both use and analyze data to inform your decision-making, and then, in turn, use that data to explore and explain key aspects of your project. I'll also discuss team management and the fundamentals of influencing. So much of the success of a project relies on teamwork, and you'll learn more about how you, as a project manager, can effectively lead your team to the finish line. Speaking of teamwork, I'll share some of the tools that provide effective team communication, along with tips for organizing and facilitating meetings. And then, we'll wrap up by discussing how to close a project. You'll learn the steps required to finish a project and the importance of celebrating a job well done with your team. Sounds kind of fun, right? After all that planning, this is the point in the project lifecycle where work gets done and everything comes together. Ready to get started? Meet me in the next video where you'll learn about the importance of tracking and measuring project progress. In previous courses, we've discussed the importance of breaking your project down into milestones and tasks, and assigning those tasks to different members of your team. We've also discussed setting a schedule and budget. But once the project execution phase gets going, how do you actually know that the work is getting done? Well, you can do this in a few ways, but primarily, you can keep tabs on project progress by tracking and measurement. This is actually a big part of project management. Tracking, by definition, is a method of following the progress of a project's activities. Measuring project performance regularly to identify deviations from the project plan can help ensure that the project stays on track. A deviation is anything that alters your original course of action. Deviations from the project plan can be positive or negative. Are you ahead of schedule because a technical problem is less complex than you estimated? Thumbs up. Did a natural disaster shut down your testing team? Big thumbs down. Both of these are examples of deviations. They're also examples of why tracking is such a crucial part of your role during the project execution phase. Let's examine some of the ways that tracking is beneficial for your project's success. To start, tracking makes key project information transparent, and transparency is essential for accurate decision-making. Even the strongest project managers make poor decisions when they lack information or context. Tracking centralizes project information so that everyone can understand the status of each part of the project, which can then help you identify gaps in your knowledge. Also, projects have so many little details, it's hard to keep everything straight. Tracking helps ensure that you don't risk forgetting something. Second, tracking helps keep all team members and stakeholders in touch with deadlines and goals. To ensure that everyone has visibility into project progress, you should have a project plan that works both for you and your team. This way, you're all on the same page about how the project is progressing. You'll learn about different ways to track a project later in this module. Tracking is also crucial for recognizing risks and issues that can derail your progress. With effective tracking, you'll be able to identify issues in a timely fashion and work with your team to take corrective action. By providing visibility into the various parts of the project, tracking helps you and your team identify and focus on areas at risk. And finally, tracking helps build confidence that the project is set to be delivered on time, in scope, and within budget. Having a clear, up-to-date picture of the overall project status keeps the team motivated and focused on staying the course. So to recap, tracking is important for a few key reasons like transparency, risk management, and keeping the project on track. Coming up, we'll take you through some of the key items to track during project execution. Meet you there. So we've discussed that tracking monitors the progress of project activities, but you may still be wondering, what specifically should you be tracking? I'll take you through a few of the most commonly tracked items that I found helpful when managing projects at Google. First, you should always track the project schedule. This is made up of tasks and activities that ensure that the project is effectively heading toward its completion date. After all, your ultimate goal is to complete your deliverables on time. Equally important is tracking the status of action items, key tasks, and activities to ensure that that work is actually getting done. Tracking tasks also helps to track your team's progress toward milestones. We learned a bit more about tracking progress toward milestones earlier in the course, and we stressed the importance of creating tasks and milestones to keep everyone on track. When you're in the middle of a project, new tasks will come up all the time. In order to avoid missing deadlines, it's imperative to track tasks as they progress and as you approach key milestones. Next, you'll also need to track costs to ensure that you don't overspend or underspend on project tasks. As I mentioned earlier, all projects have budgets, and whether or not you're overseeing the entire budget, you may be overseeing tasks and resources that have budget implications. And finally, you'll need to track key decisions, changes, dependencies, and risks to the project, including any agreed upon scope changes. This way, your team and stakeholders are aligned on what needs to be done for the project to succeed. We will cover this in more detail throughout the course since it's a big part of running the project. To recap, the items that are helpful to track throughout the project execution phase include the project schedule, which contain the key tasks and activities, the status of action items, progress toward milestones, costs, and key decisions and changes. There are many moving parts to be aware of once a project is underway. Tracking them closely benefits you and your team as you head toward the project goal. I've taken you through an introduction to tracking, and coming up, we'll discuss project management tools and templates you can use to track project activities. Now that you understand how essential tracking is, let's explore and compare various types of tracking methods. The purpose of your project plan is to guide you through the execution of your project. Therefore, it will always include at least one type of tracking method, and sometimes you might use more than one depending on what your team needs. The tracking methods we'll discuss in this video are a Gantt chart, a roadmap, and a burn-down chart. There are many others, but these are the few that I'm going to focus on. Whichever type you choose depends on what you deem suitable for your project. It's important to remember to select something that the entire team can easily understand, reference, and keep up to date. Let's compare the tracking methods I mentioned. Perhaps the most common tracking method of all is the Gantt chart. It's a tried and true tool to keep your project on track. A Gantt chart measures tasks against time and includes useful information like who will own each task and what the order of the tasks should be. For this reason, it's a useful chart for staying on schedule and for projects with many dependencies or tasks or activities or milestones that are reliant on one another. It's also a helpful chart for teams with a lot of people because ownership and responsibilities are explicitly laid out visually. As you track and move along sequentially over time, this starts to look like a waterfall, hence why Gantt charts are commonly used in waterfall project management. Each task is represented by a horizontal progress bar, and the length of the bar is dependent on how much time is allotted to the task. The bars are stacked on top of each other to denote that the task at the top must be completed before the next one below it can be completed. Gantt charts typically live in your project plan and are updated as the project progresses. Another common tracking method we have here at Google is a roadmap. A roadmap is best suited for when you need a way to track big milestones in your project. It's useful for illustrating how a project should evolve over time to a team and key stakeholders. Here's an example. A roadmap might list your project's goals at the top and a description of the approach you'll be taking to meet those goals. In this example, the goals are to increase online business-to-consumer sales by 20% year over year and to increase holiday sales to existing customers by 8% over last year. The approach details the main tactics your team will use to reach your goal. A roadmap also includes a high-level project overview. High level in this context means a concise summary, usually 3 to 4 sentences, to clearly state the objectives and priorities for your project. Below the goals, approach, and overview is a table that maps out what the process will entail. In this example, our table is divided into quarters that reflect the project timeline. A quarter is a 3-month period on a company's financial calendar. Key milestones are listed for each quarter. Then there are tasks that each team member or department needs to complete. Most tasks may map to a milestone due within the same quarter. In our example, the project as a whole has a key milestone in Q1 to finalize inventory for the holiday season. The work of product testing and finalizing suggestions for offerings mainly falls to the marketing and sales teams. However, sometimes the tasks may need to be completed in advance to unblock another team or milestone in future quarters. The product and engineering team is working on tasks in Q1 and in Q2 that lead up to the launch of the refreshed online store in Q3. In order to reach that milestone, each department needs to complete specific tasks, and the roadmap tracks both individual and project progress toward milestones. Finally, there's the burn-down chart, the most granular of the 3 tracking methods. A burn-down chart measures time against the amount of work done and the amount of work remaining. Their main uses are to keep the project team on top of targeted completion dates and to keep the team aware of scope creep as it occurs. Burn-down charts are best suited for projects that require a detailed, broken-down review of each task associated with a project. And they're great for projects where finishing on time is the top priority. The y-axis, or the vertical axis, symbolizes the number of tasks left to complete, and the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, signifies time. Progress gets tracked from the upper left-hand corner of the chart. As the project goes along, you'll track down, working your way toward 0 remaining tasks, and to the right, working your way toward your end date. There's typically a dotted line for your expected or projected progress based on the rate your team is expected to close tasks, and a solid line representing your actual progress. Before you continue on with your project, you'll need to decide which tracker makes the most sense. If you need to communicate milestones to a large team, you might choose a roadmap. If you have a project with multiple dependencies, you might choose a Gantt chart. If tracking tasks against your deadline is especially important, then the burn-down chart might be your best option. And you may even decide to use more than one. Because the tracking method will be determined by the type of project you're working on, your resources, and the project scope, you'll probably end up using several types of tracking methods at some point in your career. In my time at Google, I've regularly combined methods and used a few different types together. For example, using a Gantt chart to scope work at the beginning of a project, then switching to a burn-down chart in the weeks before a launch to make sure we're good to go. Now you know a bit more about the various types of tracking methods, including a roadmap, Gantt chart, and burn-down chart. Next up, we'll focus on understanding continuous improvement and process improvement. In this module, we'll learn why risks and changes might occur during a project and how that can impact your project's scope. You may remember that a risk is a potential event that might occur and could impact your project. When you think about risks in the context of project management, you'll think about them as hypothetical. In other words, These might not be events that will definitely happen, but because there's a possibility that they could happen, it's your responsibility as a project manager to identify and plan for those risks. Let's revisit some examples of risks. A project risk might be a contractor missing a deadline, or introducing a tool that may lead to communication breakdown within your team, or unexpected additional work because of an unforeseen policy being put in place. When any risk occurs, the consequence is a change to the project plan. A change is anything that alters or impacts the tasks, structures, or processes within a project. Changes are typically unexpected. More often than not, they have a negative impact on the project, and you'll have to learn to navigate that. But sometimes, and I'm placing a heavy emphasis on sometimes, changes can have a positive impact. Changes can encompass any variance from the original project plan in regards to the triple constraint. This may entail changing priorities and scope, budget and resources, or changes to the project timeline. We'll discuss how the internal and external dependencies of a project impact each other and bring about change. Let's go through a few types of changes that can affect your project. Some examples of changes may include new or changing dependencies. Dependencies are tasks, activities, or milestones that are reliant on one another. So if one task isn't completed on time, it may put your other tasks behind. You might be in charge of renovations on a home where there are dependencies. In a bathroom remodel, for instance, a new sink cannot be installed until the vanity and plumbing are in place. Next is changing priorities. The scope of the remodel changes if your client's in-laws suddenly have to move in, and you have to move up planned work on the spare bedroom before completing the bathroom remodel. Next up, the capacity and people available could change. Maybe you have to replace the plumber because you had issues on the job site. Another type of change could include a new limitation on your budget or resources. For example, you need to reduce design costs in the new bathroom by 10% because your quotes for electrical work come in higher than expected. Another change could be scope creep. Scope creep is when changes, growth, and other factors affect the project scope. For instance, your clients are so happy with the tile in the new bathroom that they'd like to replace the tile in all of their bathrooms. And finally, force majeure. This is another change that could occur due to a national or international crisis. If you aren't familiar with this term, it means an unforeseen circumstance that prevents someone from fulfilling the contract due to a major crisis. Force majeure is pretty uncommon, but for instance, if a union goes on strike, certain vendors won't be able to fulfill their contracts. If there's a pandemic, all production on your new product might be halted. Changes should be measured against the baseline estimates of scope, budget, and time allotted for your project, given the original requirements. Be mindful that when you change any one of those things, there may be knock-on effects, which could be positive or negative. For instance, your clients may believe they have beautiful hardwood floors hiding underneath old living room carpet, and want to pull up the old carpet and use the original hardwood floors underneath. You, the project manager on this particular construction job, you've budgeted to have the carpet removed and the old floors sanded and stained. Bad news, you pull up the carpet and find that the floors are in bad shape and rotting. They'll need to be replaced or repaired, which could be costly. So your timeline and budget are likely to take a hit. When it comes to who takes on the responsibility of managing the changing scope, it'll be you, the project manager. But depending on the project, you probably won't do it alone. In order to properly manage changes, you'll want to refer to documents like your statement of work and the RACI chart, but you might also have to create some new documentation. You'll want to create or familiarize yourself with the processes for requesting changes for your team or organization. These processes might include a change request form. Let's discuss change request forms. You and your stakeholders will use these forms in order to stay on top of and adequately manage any changes. Since a lot of people with different roles on the project can fill out these forms, it's important for the forms to be self-explanatory and very thorough. In the provided template, which uses a 2x10 table, you'll need to include information in the cells such as the project name, the discussion owner, who's taking the lead on this discussion from the team, discussion type. You'll want to let your audience know if you'll be discussing a risk, opportunity, or anything else. You'll want to identify the teams involved and the expected outcome of the discussion, which might be a change in priorities, schedule change, or an official call on how to proceed with an issue. Add the target date for discussion and identify which milestones or goals might be impacted. Provide a short description of the current situation, the change, and any difference you expect to make to the plan of record, like a snapshot of the before and after. Then go into in-depth proposal for the necessary changes and address any trade-offs. And finally, provide any background information so that everyone shares the same context. You can also refer to your statement of work, or SOW, for more information about who needs to be involved in that conversation. If you find that one or more of your milestones are at risk of not being completed, then you'll need to get a customer sign-off before the scope, deadline, or budget are changed, and all parties involved need to be informed. Great work! We've reviewed how to define risk and know more about how to identify the reasons why risks and changes might occur during a project. And now we can explain the impact of increasing a project scope. In the next So we've covered risks and how they affect a project, but we haven't fully discussed dependencies, arguably one of the biggest factors in a project. In this video, we'll discuss dependencies, both internal and external, how to identify and track them, as well as their importance. There are a few different types of dependencies, and we'll discuss a few examples of each one. So what exactly are dependencies? Dependencies are the links that connect one project task to another, and as we mentioned, they're often the greatest source of risk to a project. Two or more project tasks may have a relationship with one another in which the completion of one task is reliant on the initiation of another task, and vice versa. Think of these tasks like a line of dominoes, toppling each other over one by one. If one domino falls, it'll knock the next one over, and so on and so on. For instance, a construction company may have a number of jobs across the city. Each project requires a foreman and a project manager to be chosen before the requirements, timeline, and budget get sign-off, and the crew is chosen. You wouldn't choose a crew and tell them to get to work before the work has been clearly scoped and the contracts were signed. That's an example of an internal dependency, which describes the relationship between two tasks within the same project. External dependencies, on the other hand, refer to tasks that are reliant on outside factors, like regulatory agencies or other projects. For instance, if a construction company is scheduled to demolish a building site, they'll have to wait until their project is approved by the city. External dependencies aren't always in the project manager's control, but it's important to be aware of them so that the project stays on track. Mandatory dependencies are tasks that are legally or contractually required. For instance, when that construction company finishes the demolition and starts the rebuild, they'll first have to pour a concrete foundation and then have it inspected by the city to ensure it meets their standards before the construction company can continue to build. Lastly, discretionary dependencies are defined by the project team. These are dependencies that could occur on their own, but the team saw a need to make those dependencies reliant on one another. For instance, the construction company may be using concrete from a new supplier and want to run a test, pouring a portion of the foundation to get a better estimate of the total amount of product they'll need to complete the foundation rather than buying too much or too little product up front. The task of pouring a portion of the foundation comes first because the team needed more information before making a decision. A project manager has to work diligently to incorporate dependency management. Dependency management is the process of managing all of these interrelated tasks and resources within the project to ensure that your overall project is completed successfully, on time, and in budget. To pursue effective dependency management, there are 4 important steps that a project manager can take: proper identification, recording dependencies, continuous monitoring and control, and efficient communication. The first step is proper identification. A project manager will have to brainstorm all possible project dependencies with their team and categorize them accordingly. Next step is recording dependencies. After all dependencies are identified, a risk register should be created. A risk register is a table or chart that contains your list of risks and dependencies. The risk register should include a description of the dependency, the date, and all activities or tasks that may be impacted by the dependency. Then, a project manager will want to maintain continuous monitoring and control. This means you will want to schedule regular meetings to check in on the interrelated tasks, staying up to date on any progress being made, and double-checking for changes that will impact other tasks. Last up is efficient communication. Keeping the project team and stakeholders updated can help resolve dependencies and keep the project going strong. To recap, we just discussed how to define dependencies, both internal and external, and we learned the importance of managing and tracking dependencies. We also discussed the importance of clearly defining dependencies at the project outset, like in our foundation example, and learned about dependency management. Earlier, we talked at length about identifying and managing risks. Risk management is absolutely critical to a project's success, so in this video, we'll introduce additional techniques for managing risks. Let's start with a reminder of the definition of risk management. Risk management is the process of identifying potential risks and issues which could impact a project, then evaluating and applying steps to address the effects of the identified risks and issues. One way to manage risks and hopefully prevent any risks from materializing is to focus on managing the changes and dependencies as well as any scope creep in your project. If you can manage those two things, both changes and dependencies and scope creep, other types of risks become much easier to manage. If your dependencies are met on time, your team is less likely to fall behind schedule. If your scope is tightly managed, you're less likely to incur changes to your budget or be forced to extend your timeline. Brainstorming with your team is one of the most effective techniques for identifying risks in a project. Your teammates likely bring skills and experience from previous projects, which can help suss out similarities and keep you from repeating any issues. As we brainstorm with our team, it's best to create a risk register. As a refresher, a risk register is a table or chart that contains your team's list of risks. You'll want to pose questions to your team like, what could improve the outcome of the project? Or what could hurt or hinder it? You'll list them all as if-then statements. For example, if a given event happens, then here's how the project is impacted. To help prioritize risks within your risk register, you can calculate your risk exposure. Risk exposure is a way to measure the potential future loss resulting from a specific activity or event. A good method to calculate risk exposure is to build a matrix, like this one. When building out your matrix, you'll use two variables, risk impact and probability. Write risk impact at the top, horizontal axis, and write probability on the side, vertical axis. Mark high, medium, and low along each axis as well, across the top, from left to right, and down the side, from top to bottom, because that's how you're going to chart risk exposure. Add each risk to the chart at the cross-section of the impact the risk might have on your project and probability or likelihood of the risk coming to pass. This is one technique, but whatever strategy you use to examine your risk exposure, your risks will need to be prioritized so that you know and your team knows which ones to give immediate attention to. For anything that has a high impact on your project, even if it has a low probability of occurring, make sure to have a mitigation plan in place. How will you handle this risk if it actually materializes? While a risk register is a great tool, it's still likely that some unforeseen risk will arise. It's almost impossible to account for every single risk over the course of a project. That's where the ROAM technique can help. The ROAM technique, which stands for resolved, owned, accepted, and mitigated, is used to help manage actions after risks arise. Once a risk has materialized, you need to decide what to do with it. If a risk has been eliminated and will not be a problem, it goes into your resolved category. If you give a team member ownership over a certain risk and entrust them to handle it, that risk goes into the owned category and is monitored through to completion. If the risk has been accepted, it has been agreed that nothing will be done about it. Finally, if some action has been taken such that the risk has been mitigated, either reducing the likelihood of it occurring or reducing the impact to the project, it goes into the mitigated category. After each risk is placed into a category, the team will discuss each risk and decide which should be prioritized. Awesome! Now you've learned a bit more about how to differentiate risks and issues, as well as some new techniques to manage various risks. Hi again. In this video, we're going to learn about a common strategy used to resolve problems in a project. On top of several other tasks, it's a project manager's responsibility to resolve problems and remove constraints that are a detriment to the project's success. One way to do this is to escalate. Escalation is the process of enlisting the help of higher-level project leadership or management to remove an obstacle, clarify or reinforce priorities, and validate next steps. Escalation may seem to have a negative connotation, but that's not the case in project management. In project management, escalation should be encouraged, used often, and even celebrated. Escalations are healthy and act as a kind of checks and balances tool to make sure appropriate action is being taken. They can result in speedy decision-making, and generally, the quicker a problem is resolved, the better off a project will be. Instead of going back and forth between two team members who can't agree, an objective third party might help make the call and reduce frustrations within the team. Finally, escalations encourage participation. Encouraging others to participate in solving or owning problems can promote trust and shared responsibility among teammates, which are signs of a healthy, functional team. Before starting work on a project, the project manager, the team, and the project sponsor should establish escalation standards and practices. This means they'll specify who the issues will be raised to, how issues are raised, and the forum for discussion. A little upfront work will help escalations run smoothly, when and if they are needed. So you know what an escalation is and when to set the framework for managing escalations, but how do you know when to escalate? A project manager should escalate an issue at the first sign of critical problems in the project. Critical problems are issues that may cause a delay to a major project milestone, issues that cause budget overruns, issues that can result in the loss of a customer, and issues that push back the estimated project completion date. Basically, anything that will affect your triple constraint, time, budget, and scope, is something that should be escalated. Escalation is great for preventing two common issues within a project: trench wars and bad compromises. Trench wars occur when two peers or groups can't seem to come to an agreement, and neither party is willing to give in. This leads to a standstill in the project and will likely delay certain aspects of the project's progress. Typically, we think of compromises as a positive way to resolve issues. But there is such a thing as a bad compromise. A bad compromise occurs when two parties settle on a so-called solution, but the end product still suffers. When it comes to compromising on important project goals, it's not productive for either party to settle simply because it's a means to an end. Yes, compromise, while also keeping the larger project goals in mind and working towards those together. You may have to help your team or stakeholders make hard choices for the greater good. So now we've defined escalation, how to use the triple constraints model when communicating to stakeholders and negotiating changes, and we learned about trench wars and bad compromises, which are two common issues on a project. You've probably come to an understanding that effective communication leads to positive outcomes in every aspect of your life. The same is true for communicating changes in projects. Communicating change to project team members and stakeholders isn't just a matter of keeping your tracking documents up to date. Even the smallest changes will be meaningful to someone on your team and should be communicated. It's also true that you'll need to tailor your communication tactics based on the subject matter and recipient. As a project manager, sometimes you're going to want to have a meeting with your whole team, while other times an email might suffice. Personally, I prefer having a quick coffee or hallway chat with my teammates, and then following it up with an email noting what we agreed upon. This is particularly useful when you need quick agreement or if the subject is a little sensitive. How will you know which communication tactic is appropriate? Ultimately, you'll have to use your own judgment, but here are some ways you can decide which route to take. As a project manager, when communicating a small change that will affect an individual, it's a good idea to send an email. Be sure to avoid emotional topics or anything that needs to be discussed in depth. Just give them a heads up and set a meeting time. Weekly meetings may not be necessary, particularly if your agenda is short. If you set a meeting and then decide against it, you can either pivot to an email or move the topic to a different forum. When there's a big change within your project that impacts more than one person and is likely to change the budget, deadline, or scope of the project, you'll probably want to have a team meeting. One useful tactic to keep in mind when navigating these changes in your project is called a timeout. A timeout means taking a moment away from the project in order to take a breath, regroup, and adjust the game plan. A timeout may temporarily disrupt your momentum, but it may be absolutely necessary to set you up for success in the long run. You may want to take a timeout when the client wants to redefine the scope of the project, or if team members get reassigned to other projects and you need a plan to backfill them. This timeout is a chance for the project team to evaluate the changes so they can adjust the plan as needed. Throughout the process, you'll want to hold meetings in order to discuss successes, setbacks, and possible future improvements to the project. These meetings are called retrospectives. Retrospectives are held throughout the project's life cycle. A retrospective focuses on identifying the contributing causes of an incident or pattern of incidents without blaming one individual. While conducting a retrospective, you should always assume that everyone has good intentions and did the right thing with the information they had, whether or not it worked out well in the end. There's always a chance to learn and do better. As a project manager, it's important to identify effective techniques for communicating changes to an individual teammate or to your whole team. You now know a bit more about taking a timeout and the idea of a retrospective to have productive conversations about incidents that arise during your project.
Congratulations on finishing this video in the Google Project Management Certificate. Access the full learning experience, including job search help, and start to earn your official certificate by clicking on the icon. To view the next course in this video, click here and subscribe to our channel to learn more from Google Career Certificates.